Sometimes a man's worth isn't measured by what others see, but by what he refuses to give up. When the whole town laughs at you for holding on to what they call worthless land, it takes a special kind of faith to keep believing in something greater. Old Ezekiel Boone inherited a patch of desert that nobody wanted, and folks in Mesilla made sure he knew it every day. They called him a fool for staying on that barren ranch instead of cutting his losses. But Ezekiel remembered his uncle's stories about treasure hidden beneath the Devil's Tooth bluff. One evening, he found old letters tucked behind his cabin's hearthstone maps left by a Spanish explorer and a missing priest. Those faded papers led him to a silver mine worth $12 million. But when word spreads about that kind of money, every desperate man in the territory comes calling. How long can one aging cowboy protect a fortune that could change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the desolate stretch of New Mexico territory that Ezekiel Boone now called home, though most folks in Mesilla wouldn't dignify it with such a name. The land stretched before him like a testament to God's sense of humor, miles of scrub brush, scattered mesquite, and red clay earth that cracked under the relentless heat like an old man's weathered hands. At 60 winters, Ezekiel bore his own collection of cracks and weathered lines, each one earned through service under General Andrew Jackson and 30 years of frontier living that had bent but never broken his spirit. The ranch house, if it could be called such, squatted against the landscape like an afterthought. Adobe walls that Uncle Jeremiah had built decades earlier now showed gaps where the mortar had given up its fight against wind and weather. The roof leaked in 3 places, and the front door hung crooked on hinges that groaned like old bones whenever the desert wind picked up. But it was home, and more importantly, it was his, the only thing of value that life had ever handed him without demanding blood in return. Uncle Jeremiah's worn Bible sat on the rough-hewn table near the window, its leather binding soft as chamois from years of handling. Pressed between its pages were wildflowers that his uncle had collected during better seasons, Indian paintbrush, desert marigold, and purple lupine marking passages about faith and perseverance that had sustained the old man through his final years. Ezekiel often found himself reading those same verses when the loneliness pressed too hard against his chest, when the silence of the desert seemed to echo with the ghosts of all the men he'd buried under Jackson's banner. The war had changed him, as wars change all men who survive them. He'd been barely 30 when he'd answered Jackson's call to arms, full of righteous fury and the certainty that came with youth. The Creek War had tested that certainty, and the battles that followed had ground it down to something harder and more practical, the knowledge that a man does what he must, bears what he can, and finds grace in small mercies where they present themselves. Those small mercies were scarce in Mesilla, where his presence seemed to remind folks of uncomfortable truths about charity and Christian kindness. The town itself was little more than a trading post and a handful of buildings clustered around a dusty main street, but it served the scattered ranchers and miners who eked out livings from the harsh country. Sheriff Clayton Morse kept the peace with a combination of common sense and a well-maintained Colt revolver, though his patience with Ezekiel had grown thin since the inheritance became public knowledge. "Don't make sense, him staying out there," Morse had said to anyone who'd listen. "Man his age ought to know when to fold his hand and move on to something more reasonable." The sheriff's words carried weight in Mesilla, partly because he'd proven himself fair in his dealings, and partly because he was one of the few men who'd managed to prosper in the territory without obvious corruption. But his disapproval of Ezekiel's stubbornness had set a tone that others were quick to follow. Widow Sarah Hawthorne, who ran the general store with the efficiency of a woman who'd learned to depend on no one but herself, had shown more kindness than most. Her husband had died of fever 3 years prior, leaving her with a business to run and a reputation to maintain in a town where unmarried women walked a narrow line between respectability and ruin. She was perhaps 45, with graying brown hair always pinned back practical-like, and hands that showed the calluses of honest work. "You need supplies. You come see me," she'd told Ezekiel after the funeral, her voice gentle but not pitying. Credit's good for a man who pays his debts. It was more courtesy than he'd received from Cornelius Webb, the banker whose soft hands and calculating eyes marked him as a man who'd never worked a day in the sun. Webb had made his feelings about the inheritance clear during their first meeting, his voice carrying the particular disdain that prosperous men reserve for those they consider beneath their notice. "The property carries debts," Webb had explained, spreading papers across his desk with the precision of a man dealing cards. "Taxes, improvements, maintenance costs that your uncle let slide in his final years. I'm afraid you'll find the burden rather more than the land is worth." Webb's spectacles had caught the light as he'd leaned forward, his pale eyes studying Ezekiel like a hawk watching a field mouse. "Of course, I'd be willing to take the property off your hands for a fair price. Save you the trouble of discovering what most folks around here already know, that land's been cursed since the Apache troubles." But Ezekiel had memories that Webb couldn't calculate on his ledger sheets. He remembered Uncle Jeremiah as a young man, visiting the family farm in Tennessee, with stories of the Western Territories and eyes that held secrets like a deep well holds water. His uncle had been different from other men, quieter, more thoughtful, with a way of looking at the horizon, as if he could see things that remained hidden to ordinary folk. "There's more to that land than meets the eye, boy," Uncle Jeremiah had told him during his last visit east, his voice carrying a weight that Ezekiel hadn't understood at the time. "Sometimes what looks like nothing to one man is everything to another. Takes the right eyes to see it, and the right heart to appreciate it." The old man had pressed a small object into Ezekiel's hand, a piece of rough silver ore that caught the lamplight like captured starshine. "Found that on my property," he'd said. "Might be more where it came from, might not. But the land's got a story, and every story deserves an ending." Those words had sustained Ezekiel through the difficult journey west, and the shock of seeing his inheritance for the first time. The reality had been harsher than even his practical mind had imagined. The ranch sat in a basin surrounded by low hills, with the jagged spire of Devil's Tooth Bluff rising like a broken finger against the southern sky. Water was scarce, requiring a daily walk to a spring nearly a mile distant. The nearest neighbor lived 15 miles away, and the isolation was complete in a way that even his war experiences hadn't prepared him for. But there were compensations that a man learned to value when he'd lived long enough to understand their worth. The silence held a quality of peace that cities could never offer, broken only by the wind through the mesquite and the occasional call of a hawk circling overhead. The sunrises painted the desert in colors that had no names, and the stars at night blazed with an intensity that made a man feel both small and significant at the same time. His daily routine had settled into the rhythm that solitary men develop when they have no one to please but themselves and the requirements of survival. He rose before dawn, tended to his single horse, a steady bay mare named Patience, that Uncle Jeremiah had left behind, and walked to the spring for water. The rest of the morning was spent on whatever repairs the house demanded, which seemed to be everything at once. Afternoons were for reading, mostly his uncle's Bible, but also a collection of books that included Marcus Aurelius, whom Uncle Jeremiah had favored, and a battered copy of Don Quixote that seemed appropriate to his current circumstances. The evenings were the hardest time, when the desert cooled and his thoughts turned inward. He would sit on the sagging porch and watch the light fade from the western sky, trying to understand what had brought him to this place and what he was supposed to do with the years that remained to him. The mockery from town followed him home like dust on his boots, and there were nights when Webb's offer seemed almost reasonable. But then he would remember Uncle Jeremiah's eyes when he'd spoken about the land, the way they'd held certainty like a man holds a winning hand close to his chest. His uncle had never been given to flights of fancy, had never spoken idly about matters of consequence. If he'd believed the land held value beyond what showed on the surface, then perhaps the joke was on those who laughed too quickly. It was during one of those evening contemplations that Ezekiel had noticed the loose stone in the fireplace hearth, the way it shifted slightly when he rested his boot against it. Curiosity had led him to investigate, and investigation had led to the discovery that would change everything: the oilskin-wrapped bundle that Uncle Jeremiah had hidden away like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. The bundle had felt substantial in his hands, heavy with more than just its physical weight. As he'd unwrapped the oilskin by lamplight, his fingers had trembled with something between anticipation and dread. Inside were documents that spoke of expeditions and treasures, of Spanish cartographers and Jesuit priests, of silver deposits rich enough to ransom kings. But that discovery belonged to another chapter of his story, one that would transform him from the object of Masilla's pity into something far more dangerous, a man with hope. The evening air carried a chill that made Ezekiel grateful for the small fire crackling in his hearth. He'd spent the day mending fence posts that would likely fall again with the next strong wind, but the work kept his hands busy and his mind from dwelling on the letter that had arrived from Webb's bank, another reminder about overdue payments and the banker's generous offer to relieve him of his burden. As he settled into his uncle's worn chair with a cup of coffee that had grown cold during his evening chores, his boot knocked against the loose hearthstone he'd noticed weeks earlier. The sound was different tonight, more hollow than usual, and curiosity finally overcame his usual caution. Setting down his cup, Ezekiel knelt beside the fireplace and worked his fingers around the stone's edges. It came free easier than expected, revealing a cavity that Uncle Jeremiah had carved into the adobe foundation. Wrapped in oilskin and tied with leather cord, a bundle rested in the hidden space like a secret waiting 30 years to be discovered. Ezekiel's hands shook slightly as he lifted it, not from age, but from the weight of possibility that suddenly filled the small room. The oilskin unwrapped to reveal documents that made his breath catch in his throat. The first was a journal written in careful Spanish script, its pages yellowed but still legible in the lamplight. Don Carlos Vasquez, royal cartographer to His Catholic Majesty, had recorded his expedition into the Northern Territories in 1782, mapping silver deposits that promised to fill the Spanish crown's treasury for generations. The veins run deep beneath the formation the natives called Devil's Tooth, Vasquez had written. The ore samples test pure, richer than anything discovered in Peru. But the Apache grow restless, and we dare not establish permanent operations without greater military protection. The second document proved even more remarkable, a confession letter written by Father Miguel Santos, a Jesuit scout who'd accompanied later expeditions. His handwriting was hurried, desperate, as if he'd written by candlelight while enemies approached. "I have hidden the church's portion of the silver where only God may find it," the priest had written. "The Apache chief Standing Bear has given his word that no man shall be harmed who approaches with peaceful intent. But these are dark times, and darker men come seeking what they have not earned. The compass points true, and the cross marks the way for those with eyes to see." But it was the third item that made Ezekiel's heart race: an ornate brass compass bearing Spanish royal markings, its needle still spinning true after decades in darkness. Hidden compartments in its base contained additional papers, including a detailed map that showed the Devil's Tooth Bluff in relation to landmarks he recognized from his daily walks. The implications struck him like physical blows. The land that Webb dismissed as worthless, that the townspeople mocked as a fool's inheritance, might contain wealth beyond anything the territory had ever seen. The Spanish had been thorough in their documentation, and Father Miguel's compass provided the key to deciphering their cryptic directions. Ezekiel spread the map across his table, using the compass to align the Spanish markings with the terrain he knew. The Devil's Tooth Bluff was clearly marked, along with a series of symbols that corresponded to entries in Don Carlos's journal. A cave system, a spring marked with religious symbols, and most importantly, shaft openings that the Spanish had sealed before their hasty departure. Sleep proved impossible that night. Ezekiel paced his small cabin like a caged animal, alternating between excitement and skepticism. He'd lived through enough disappointments to know that hope could be a dangerous thing for a man his age. But the documents were genuine, the paper, the ink, the historical details, all spoke of authenticity that would be impossible to forge. By dawn, he'd made his decision. The first expedition would be cautious, just him and Patience riding to the Devil's Tooth area to see if the Spanish markings corresponded to anything real. He packed light water, hardtack, and the compass, and set out before the desert heat became unbearable. The ride to Devil's Tooth took 2 hours across terrain that tested both his horsemanship and Patience's sure footing. The bluff rose from the desert floor like a monument to some ancient catastrophe, its red stone face scarred by centuries of wind and weather. But as Ezekiel rode closer, details emerged that the Spanish map had captured with remarkable accuracy. The cave opening was exactly where Don Carlos had marked it, though partially concealed by fallen rocks and decades of accumulated debris. More importantly, carved into a protected alcove near the entrance were symbols that matched those in Father Miguel's compass, a cross surrounded by Spanish royal markings that had weathered the years but remained clearly visible. Ezekiel's hands trembled as he traced the carved symbols with his fingers. This was real. Uncle Jeremiah hadn't been chasing phantoms or indulging in old man's fantasies. The Spanish had been here, had found something worth documenting and hiding, and had left signs for those who knew how to read them. The cave mouth was too narrow for exploration without proper equipment, but Ezekiel could see that it extended deep into the bluff's interior. More carved symbols marked strategic points along the visible walls, and the air that drifted from the depths carried a metallic scent that made his pulse quicken. But as he prepared to leave, movement on a distant ridge caught his attention. A rider sat motionless against the skyline, too far away to identify, but close enough to suggest that his activities hadn't gone unnoticed. The figure watched for several minutes before disappearing behind the ridge, leaving Ezekiel with the uncomfortable certainty that his secret expedition hadn't been as secret as he'd hoped. The ride back to the ranch gave him time to consider the implications. If others knew about his treasure hunting, word would spread quickly in a small community like Masilla. Webb's pressure for the property suddenly took on a different character, and the banker's eager offers to purchase worthless land began to make a different kind of sense. That evening, as Ezekiel carefully rewrapped the Spanish documents and returned them to their hiding place, he realized that his life had changed irrevocably. The mockery from town would continue, but now it carried a different weight. He was no longer just a stubborn old man clinging to worthless land. He was a man with a secret that could transform everything. But secrets, as Uncle Jeremiah had clearly understood, could be dangerous things. The rider on the ridge suggested that others were already watching, waiting to see what treasures the Spanish maps might reveal. And in a territory where law was often decided by the fastest gun rather than the most righteous cause, a lone man with a fortune to protect was a tempting target indeed. The Spanish documents demanded careful study, and Ezekiel found himself rising before dawn each morning to examine them by lamplight when his eyes were freshest. Don Carlos Vasquez had been meticulous in his record-keeping, noting not just the location of silver deposits, but the historical context that had driven Spanish expansion into Apache territory. The cartographer's journal revealed a complex web of colonial politics and religious mission work that had brought European explorers into conflict with native tribes who'd controlled these lands for generations. The silver discovery had been accidental. Don Carlos had been mapping trade routes when his party stumbled upon ore samples that tested richer than anything found in the established mines of Mexico. The Apache call this place where the earth bleeds silver, one entry noted. Their shamans speak of warnings from ancestors about disturbing the metal spirits. Chief Standing Bear permits our presence but counsels against large-scale extraction. His wisdom may prove prophetic. Father Miguel's confession letter provided even more intriguing details. The Jesuit had been torn between his duty to the Spanish crown and his growing respect for Apache spiritual beliefs. His final entries suggested that he'd made the decision to hide the church's portion of the treasure, not just from Apache raids, but from his own countrymen whose greed had begun to corrupt the mission's original purpose. The ornate silver cross that had been wrapped with the documents bore engravings that corresponded to symbols throughout the Spanish maps. Each arm of the cross contained tiny marks that, when aligned with the compass directions, revealed additional locations where the explorers had cached supplies and equipment. It was an ingenious system that required both religious knowledge and navigational skill to decipher. Ezekiel's morning studies were interrupted by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Through his window, he watched Sheriff Morse dismount and approach the cabin with the measured pace of a man conducting official business. Quickly wrapping the documents in their oilskin covering, Ezekiel slipped them back into their hiding place and replaced the loose hearthstone. "Morning, Ezekiel," Morse said as he knocked on the door frame. "Heard you've been riding out toward Devil's Tooth lately. Folks in town are wondering what's got you interested in that particular piece of country." The sheriff's tone was casual, but his eyes held the alert watchfulness of a man who'd learned to read trouble in other men's faces. Ezekiel poured coffee for both of them, using the ritual to buy time while he considered his response. "Man gets curious about his own land," Ezekiel said finally. "Uncle Jeremiah used to talk about that bluff like it held some special meaning. Figured I ought to see what caught his attention." Morse accepted the coffee, but didn't sit down, a signal that this wasn't a social visit. "Jake Morrison's been asking questions about you around town. Says he's a mining consultant looking at investment opportunities in the territory. Seems mighty interested in your property specifically." The name meant nothing to Ezekiel, but the sheriff's concern was evident. "Haven't met the man. What kind of questions is he asking?" "The kind that suggest he knows more about your uncle's business than most folks would expect," Morse replied. "Morrison's got the look of a man who's spent time in places where the law runs thin. If he comes calling, you might want to be careful about what you tell him." After the sheriff departed, Ezekiel felt the weight of isolation more heavily than usual. The mysterious rider on the ridge now had a name, and that name came with warnings about dangerous intentions. But the Spanish documents offered hope that made the risks seem worthwhile. His next expedition to Devil's Tooth was more systematic. Using Father Miguel's cross as a key, he located the first of the supply caches mentioned in the documents. Hidden beneath a cairn of stones that had weathered into near invisibility, he found Spanish tools wrapped in oiled leather mining picks, metal pans for separating ore, and most remarkably, a collection of silver samples that proved the quality of the deposits. The ore samples were unlike anything Ezekiel had seen, streaked with veins of pure metal that caught the sunlight like captured starfire. Even his untrained eye could recognize the exceptional richness of the deposits, and he understood why the Spanish had risked Apache wrath to document their location so carefully. But as he rode home that evening, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. Twice he stopped to scan the surrounding ridges, and twice he spotted movement that suggested surveillance. Jake Morrison, if that was indeed who followed him, was being less careful about concealment than professional caution would dictate. The pattern continued over the following weeks. Each expedition revealed more evidence of Spanish activity, sealed shaft entrances, carved directional markers, and additional supply caches that proved the explorers had planned extensive mining operations before circumstances forced their withdrawal. But each trip also brought confirmation that he wasn't alone in his interest in Devil's Tooth Bluff. Widow Hawthorne proved to be an unexpected source of information when Ezekiel made his weekly supply run to town. Her general store occupied a strategic position where gossip flowed as freely as the coffee she served to customers, and her feminine intuition had picked up subtleties that escaped male notice. "That Morrison fellow's been asking about you," she said while tallying Ezekiel's purchases. "Wants to know about your uncle's habits, who visited the ranch, what kind of business Jeremiah might have been involved in." I told him Jeremiah kept to himself, but Morrison didn't seem satisfied with that answer. She leaned closer, lowering her voice despite the empty store. "There's something predatory about that man, Ezekiel. The way he watches folks when he thinks they're not looking. You'd do well to avoid him if possible." Her concern touched something in Ezekiel that had been dormant since his wife's death decades earlier. Sarah Hawthorne was offering more than casual neighborly advice. She was expressing the kind of protective worry that came from genuine caring. In a town where most folks viewed him as an object of pity or amusement, her regard felt like water in the desert. "I appreciate the warning," he said. "If Morrison comes around asking more questions, maybe you could tell him I'm just a broken-down old soldier trying to make the best of a bad situation." "I don't think that man's fool enough to believe such a story," she replied, "but I'll do what I can to discourage his curiosity." That evening, as Ezekiel studied the Spanish maps by lamplight, he realized that his situation had grown more complex than simple treasure hunting. The documents suggested wealth beyond his wildest dreams, but they also represented knowledge that dangerous men would kill to possess. Uncle Jeremiah's decision to keep the secret for 30 years suddenly seemed less like missed opportunity and more like wisdom born of understanding human nature at its worst. Don Carlos's leather map case had been crafted with the care of a man who understood that his life might depend on protecting its contents. The Spanish cartographer had used the finest materials available, oiled leather that remained supple after decades, brass fittings that showed no signs of corrosion, and multiple compartments designed to separate different types of documents. Ezekiel discovered the hidden compartment by accident while examining the case's construction. A slight pressure on what appeared to be decorative brass work revealed a spring-loaded panel that contained the most valuable contents of all actual silver ore samples wrapped in silk, along with detailed assay notes that documented the purity and estimated value of the deposits. The ore samples were magnificent, streaked with veins of metal so pure they seemed to glow in the lamplight. Don Carlos had been systematic in his collection, gathering specimens from different areas of the mine system and noting the depth at which each had been found. His assay notes, written in the precise language of a man trained in metallurgy, estimated the total value of the accessible deposits at figures that made Ezekiel's hands shake. Conservative estimates suggest sufficient ore to support mining operations for 20 years, one entry noted. The deeper shafts remain unexplored due to flooding, but surface sampling indicates continuation of the primary vein system. Total estimated value exceeds any discovery in the Northern Territories. But understanding the treasure's value was one thing, reaching it safely was proving to be another challenge entirely. Ezekiel's systematic exploration of the Devil's Tooth area had revealed the scope of Spanish mining activities, including shaft entrances that had been carefully sealed with stones and mortar designed to blend with the natural rock face. The Spanish had left no obvious traces for casual observers, but their maps made the concealed entrances clearly identifiable to someone who knew what to look for. The cave system extended deeper into the bluff than Ezekiel had initially realized. Using Spanish mining tools from the supply caches, he'd managed to clear enough debris from the main entrance to explore the first chambers. What he found there took his breath away: carved support, timbers still sound after decades, metal rails for ore carts, and most remarkably, mining equipment that the Spanish had been forced to abandon when circumstances required their hasty departure. But he wasn't alone in his interest in the Spanish workings. The surveillance had become more obvious and more threatening. Jake Morrison had abandoned any pretense of subtlety, positioning himself on ridges where his presence would be noticed, sending a clear message that Ezekiel's activities were being monitored and evaluated. The confrontation came on a Tuesday morning as Ezekiel prepared for another expedition to the mine. Morrison emerged from behind a stand of mesquite trees near the ranch house, his horse hidden from casual view but positioned to cut off retreat toward town. He was a lean man in his 40s, with the hard eyes of someone who'd spent years taking what he wanted from those too weak to resist. "Morning, Boone," Morrison said, his voice carrying the casual menace of a man accustomed to intimidation. "Heard you've been spending a lot of time up at Devil's Tooth. Mining consultant like myself gets curious about what might interest a retired soldier in that particular piece of country." Ezekiel kept his hands visible and his voice steady. "Just getting to know my property. Man's got a right to explore his own land." Morrison's smile held no warmth. Course he does, but sometimes a man finds things that are bigger than he can handle alone. Sometimes he needs partners with the right kind of experience and resources. Not looking for partners, Ezekiel replied. Whatever's on my land belongs to me, legal and proper. The threat in Morrison's response was unmistakable. Legal's one thing, practical's another. Territory's got a way of testing a man's resolve, especially when that man's getting on in years and doesn't have much backup when trouble comes calling. After Morrison departed, Ezekiel realized that his situation had entered a new phase. The mining consultant's words had been carefully chosen to avoid direct threats while making his intentions clear. This wasn't a man who would be discouraged by refusal or deterred by legal ownership. Morrison wanted the treasure, and he had the look of someone willing to use violence to get it. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor who offered a different perspective on the developing situation. Widow Hawthorne arrived at the ranch driving a supply wagon, ostensibly delivering goods that Ezekiel had ordered, but actually providing an excuse to check on his welfare. Jake Morrison came by the store this morning, she said while helping unload supplies. Asked a lot of questions about your uncle's visitors over the years, whether Jeremiah ever talked about finding anything valuable on the property. I told him your uncle was a private man who kept his business to himself. Her presence at the isolated ranch was a risk to her reputation, but Sarah seemed more concerned about Ezekiel's safety than social proprieties. As they worked together, she shared information that cast new light on Uncle Jeremiah's final years. Your uncle had visitors, she said, men who came at night, stayed only briefly, never came to town for supplies. I always wondered what business brought them so far out into the desert. The revelation that Uncle Jeremiah had maintained contact with unknown associates suggested that the treasure's existence wasn't the complete secret Ezekiel had assumed. Perhaps other men knew about the Spanish documents, or had been working with his uncle to develop the mine before circumstances changed. That evening, as Sarah prepared to return to town, she made an offer that surprised them both. You shouldn't be out here alone with men like Morrison prowling around. If you need help, any kind of help, you send word. There are folks in Mesilla who remember what decent behavior looks like. Her offer of assistance carried implications that extended beyond neighborly concern, and Ezekiel found himself looking at Sarah Hawthorne with new eyes. She was a handsome woman in the way that frontier life created, strong, practical, with the kind of quiet courage that kept communities functioning when times grew hard. But accepting help would mean sharing secrets, and secrets had a way of spreading beyond their intended boundaries. As Ezekiel watched Sarah's wagon disappear into the gathering dusk, he realized that his greatest challenge might not be finding the treasure or protecting it from men like Morrison. It might be learning to trust others with knowledge that could transform or destroy everything he'd worked to build. The Apache appeared at dawn like shadows given substance, their horses moving across the desert floor, with a silence that spoke of generations spent reading the language of wind and stone. Ezekiel had been preparing for another expedition to the mine when he noticed them, 3 riders positioned on the ridge above his ranch, watching with the patient alertness of men who understood that hasty movements often led to misunderstanding and bloodshed. Chief Standing Bear rode slightly ahead of his companions, a man perhaps 50 years old, whose weathered face bore the dignity of someone who'd spent decades balancing survival with honor in a changing world. He raised his right hand in the universal gesture of peaceful intent, then guided his horse down the slope toward Ezekiel's cabin with the careful precision of a diplomat approaching a potentially dangerous negotiation. You are the nephew of the man called Jeremiah, Standing Bear said in careful English, his accent carrying the rhythms of his native tongue. Your uncle was known to us. He showed respect for the old ways, understanding that some places hold spirits that should not be disturbed. Ezekiel set down the mining tools he'd been loading onto Patience, recognizing that this conversation would determine whether his treasure hunting continued or ended in violence. My uncle was a good man. If he earned your respect, then I hope to do the same. Standing Bear's dark eyes studied Ezekiel, with the intensity of a man reading character in facial expressions and body language. The place you call Devil's Tooth, we know it as where, the earth, bleeds, silver. Our grandfathers spoke of Spanish men who came seeking the metal spirits, who dug deep wounds in the sacred stone. Some wounds heal, others fester. The Apache chief dismounted, a gesture that signaled both peaceful intentions and readiness for extended conversation. His companions remained, mounted but relaxed, their weapons visible but not threatening. It was a carefully choreographed display of strength, tempered by diplomacy. The Spanish left marks, Standing Bear continued, accepting the cup of coffee that Ezekiel offered. Maps, tools, words written on paper. But they also left warnings, words carved in stone, that speak of dangers for those who disturb the metal spirits without proper understanding. The revelation that the Apache knew about the Spanish documents changed everything. Ezekiel realized that his treasure hunting hadn't been as secret as he'd assumed, and that the indigenous people whose ancestors had witnessed the original mining operations possessed knowledge that could prove invaluable. "I've found some of what the Spanish left behind," Ezekiel admitted, "but I'm not looking to disturb anything sacred. A man my age understands that some things are worth more than silver." Standing Bear's expression softened slightly, suggesting that Ezekiel's words had found their mark. "Your uncle said similar things when he first came to us. He sought permission before exploring the sacred places, offered tobacco and prayers to the spirits of our ancestors. This is why we allowed his presence." The conversation that followed revealed the complex history of Spanish-Apache relations during the colonial period. The Apache had initially tolerated limited mining activities in exchange for trade goods and promises of mutual respect. But as Spanish operations expanded and military protection increased, the delicate balance had collapsed into warfare that ultimately drove the Europeans from the territory. Chief Standing Bear, of that time my grandfather's uncle, made agreement with the Spanish priest, the current chief explained. The church's portion of silver would remain hidden until a man came who understood both the value of metal and the cost of taking it from the earth. Your uncle believed you might be such a man. The implications were staggering. Uncle Jeremiah hadn't stumbled upon the Spanish treasure by accident. He'd been chosen by the Apache as a guardian, someone trusted to protect the sacred site from those who would exploit it without understanding. And now that responsibility had passed to Ezekiel. But Standing Bear's visit wasn't purely ceremonial. His intelligence network had detected the same threats that Ezekiel had noticed, and the Apache chief brought warnings that confirmed his worst fears about Jake Morrison. "Shadow men come from the east," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying the weight of certain knowledge. "Men who follow the one called Morrison, men whose hearts are black with greed. They do not seek permission or offer respect. They take what they want and leave death behind them." The Apache had been watching Morrison's activities with the same systematic attention they'd once devoted to tracking enemy war parties. Their scouts had counted at least 6 men in Morrison's group, all armed and equipped for extended operations in the desert. More importantly, they'd observed Morrison's men conducting their own reconnaissance of the Devil's Tooth area, suggesting that the mining consultant possessed more detailed knowledge of the Spanish operations than he'd initially revealed. "Your uncle feared this day would come," Standing Bear continued. "He spoke of men who would follow the old maps, who would bring violence to the sacred places. This is why he chose to wait, to hide the truth until the right guardian could be found." The conversation concluded with an offer that transformed Ezekiel's understanding of his situation. The Apache weren't just neutral observers of his conflict with Morrison. They were prepared to actively defend the sacred site against desecration. But their protection came with conditions that required careful consideration. "We will watch the shadow men," Standing Bear promised. "We will ensure that violence does not come to the sacred places without warning. But you must understand, if you choose to disturb the metal spirits, you assume responsibility for all consequences that follow." As the Apache departed, Chief Standing Bear presented Ezekiel with a gift that carried profound symbolic meaning, a ceremonial peace pipe carved from red stone and decorated with silver inlay. The pipe represented formal recognition of Ezekiel's status as guardian of the sacred site, but it also served as a tangible reminder of the spiritual responsibilities that accompanied material wealth. That afternoon, as Ezekiel examined the peace pipe in the privacy of his cabin, he realized that his treasure hunt had evolved into something far more complex than simple fortune-seeking. The Spanish silver represented not just personal wealth, but a trust that connected him to generations of men who'd struggled to balance material desires with spiritual obligations. The Apache alliance offered protection against Morrison's threats, but it also elevated the stakes of failure. If Ezekiel couldn't protect the treasure from those who would exploit it purely for profit, he would be betraying not only his uncle's memory, but the trust of people whose ancestors had died, defending these lands from foreign invaders. The discovery came on a morning when the desert air held the crisp promise of autumn, though seasons change subtly in this harsh country where survival demanded attention to details that city dwellers never learned to read. Ezekiel had been examining the deepest accessible chamber of the Spanish mine when his lamp illuminated something that made his breath catch: a leather-bound journal wrapped in oilcloth and tucked into a natural alcove where it had waited decades for discovery. Uncle Jeremiah's handwriting filled the pages, documenting a treasure hunt that had begun 30 years earlier when he'd first arrived in the territory as a young man seeking his fortune in the aftermath of economic upheaval back east. The journal revealed that everything Ezekiel had assumed about his inheritance was incomplete. Uncle Jeremiah hadn't just stumbled upon the Spanish documents, he'd been actively searching for them, based on stories passed down through Apache oral tradition. Met with Chief Standing Bear's father today, one early entry noted. The old chief remembers his grandfather's stories about Spanish priests who hid church silver rather than let it fall into military hands. Says the spirits of the mine have been waiting for the right man to claim guardianship, someone who understands that wealth without wisdom leads to destruction. The journal chronicled Uncle Jeremiah's painstaking relationship building with the Apache, his gradual earning of their trust, and his eventual discovery of the Spanish documents in a location that the indigenous people had protected for generations. But more importantly, it revealed why his uncle had chosen never to extract the silver for personal gain. Saw what gold fever did to men in California, Uncle Jeremiah had written. Watched decent folks transform into something less than human when precious metal entered the picture. The Apache are right to be cautious about disturbing these deposits. Some treasures carry curses that have nothing to do with supernatural forces and everything to do with human nature at its worst. The philosophical passages that followed showed a man wrestling with temptation while developing a deeper understanding of wealth's true cost. Uncle Jeremiah had calculated the silver's value at over $12 million in current market prices, enough to transform not just his own life, but the entire economic structure of the territory. Yet he'd chosen to leave it undisturbed, waiting for someone who might prove worthy of the responsibility. Ezekiel writes that he's coming west after Martha's death, a later entry revealed. My nephew has known loss, has served his country with honor, understands that some things matter more than personal comfort. Perhaps he'll be the guardian the Apache have been waiting for, someone who can balance the treasure's power with wisdom earned through suffering. But the journal's final entries carried warnings that proved uncomfortably prophetic. Uncle Jeremiah had become aware of other men seeking the Spanish treasure, individuals whose research into colonial mining operations had led them to the Devil's Tooth area. His death, which the town had attributed to natural causes, had occurred shortly after he'd discovered evidence of surveillance around his ranch. Morrison came by again today, asking the same questions with increasing insistence. One of the last entries noted, claims to be researching territorial mining history, but his eyes hold the calculating gleam of a man who's found something valuable. Told him I knew nothing about Spanish operations, but doubt he believed the deception. may need to accelerate plans for transferring guardianship to Ezekiel. The implications struck Ezekiel like physical blows. His uncle's death hadn't been the peaceful passing that everyone assumed. It had been the culmination of increasing pressure from men who suspected the truth about the Spanish treasure. Uncle Jeremiah had died protecting secrets that he'd hoped to pass safely to someone capable of bearing the burden. That afternoon brought confirmation of the journal's warnings in the form of Jake Morrison himself, riding up to the ranch with the confident swagger of a man who no longer felt the need for subtlety. He was accompanied by two other men whose hard faces and practiced alertness marked them as professionals accustomed to violence. "Afternoon, Boone," Morrison said, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "Time we had a more direct conversation about your uncle's business interests. See, I've been doing research into Spanish colonial mining operations, and your property keeps coming up in some interesting historical documents." Ezekiel remained on his porch, keeping the wooden railing between himself and the visitors, while maintaining access to the loaded rifle that leaned against the cabin wall. "Told you before, whatever's on my land belongs to me, legal and proper." Morrison's smile held no warmth. "Legal's a funny thing in territory this remote. Sometimes a man's legal rights depend more on his ability to defend them than on what's written in some courthouse ledger back east." The threat was unmistakable, but Morrison wasn't finished. He produced a document from his saddlebags, official-looking papers bearing territorial seals and legal language that claimed to establish his partnership with Uncle Jeremiah in developing mineral rights on the property. "Your uncle was more business-minded than he let on," Morrison claimed. "Signed these partnership agreements shortly before his unfortunate passing. Course, with Jeremiah gone, his obligations transfer to his heir, meaning you and me are partners, whether you like it or not." Ezekiel's hands tightened on the rifle as he recognized the sophisticated nature of Morrison's scheme. The forged documents were convincing enough to create legal complications that could tie up the property in territorial courts for years, giving Morrison and his associates time to extract whatever they wanted from the Spanish mine. "Partnership requires willing participants," Ezekiel replied. "I'm not willing." Morrison's companions had spread out during the conversation, positioning themselves to cut off escape routes while maintaining the pretense of casual conversation. Their professional competence was evident in the way they moved, and Ezekiel realized that he was facing men who'd planned this confrontation carefully. "Willing's got nothing to do with it," Morrison said. "Legal documents are legal documents, and territory courts tend to respect properly executed business agreements. Of course, we could settle this more privately if you're inclined to be reasonable about sharing what your uncle discovered." The standoff might have escalated to violence if not for the timely arrival of Widow Hawthorne, whose supply wagon appeared on the horizon at precisely the moment when Morrison's patience seemed to be reaching its limit. The mining consultant clearly hadn't expected witnesses to his intimidation tactics, and Sarah's presence forced him to maintain the pretense of legitimate business discussion. "We'll be back," Morrison promised as he and his men prepared to depart. "Territory courts meet next month, and I expect you'll want to discuss our partnership arrangements before then. Might save everyone a lot of unnecessary complications." As Morrison rode away, Ezekiel realized that his situation had entered its most dangerous phase. The enemy was no longer content with surveillance and subtle threats. They were prepared to use forged legal documents and outright violence to claim the Spanish treasure. And with Uncle Jeremiah's journal confirming his worst suspicions about his uncle's death, Ezekiel understood that he was fighting for more than just personal wealth. He was fighting for justice and the honor of men who died, protecting secrets that others would kill to possess. The revelation came through accident, as truth often does when carefully constructed deceptions finally crumble under the weight of their own complexity. Ezekiel had been examining Morrison's forged partnership documents by lamplight, trying to understand the legal language that threatened to steal his inheritance. When he noticed something that made his blood run cold, the territorial seal bore the same distinctive notary mark that appeared on the mortgage papers he'd received from Cornelius Webb's bank. The connection struck him like a physical blow. Webb, the soft-handed banker who'd been pressuring him to sell the worthless property, wasn't just an opportunistic creditor seeking to foreclose on unprofitable land. He was Morrison's partner, the financial architect behind a scheme that had been years in the making. Everything suddenly made terrible sense. Webb's eager offers to purchase the property, his intimate knowledge of the ranch's financial difficulties, his ability to produce legal documents that created pressure for quick sale, all of it had been orchestrated to separate Ezekiel from land that the banker knew contained a fortune in Spanish silver. That night brought no sleep, only the bitter understanding that his enemy hadn't been the obvious threat of Morrison's violence, but the subtle corruption of institutional authority. Webb had been using his position as Masilla's primary banker to manipulate the entire situation, creating artificial financial pressures while maintaining the respectable facade of legitimate business practice. Dawn brought Sheriff Morse to the ranch, but his visit carried none of the friendly courtesy that Ezekiel had come to expect. The lawman's face showed the strain of a man wrestling with conflicting loyalties, and his words confirmed Ezekiel's worst fears about the scope of Webb's influence. "Got some legal papers from the territorial court," Morse said, his voice heavy with reluctance. "Seems there's question about the validity of your uncle's will. Webb's filed a creditor's claim that could tie up the property until the courts sort out what's what." The sheriff's discomfort was evident as he handed over the official documents, but duty required him to serve legal papers, regardless of his personal feelings about their legitimacy. "I don't like this any more than you do, Ezekiel, but law's law, and I took an oath to uphold it even when it doesn't sit right." Ezekiel read through the legal language with growing understanding of Webb's sophisticated strategy. The banker had created a paper trail that suggested Uncle Jeremiah had borrowed extensively against the property, using forged documents to establish debts that required immediate settlement. The territorial court, lacking detailed knowledge of local relationships and relying on Webb's reputation as a respectable businessman, had issued orders that effectively froze Ezekiel's ownership rights pending resolution of the creditor claims. "How long have you known Webb was crooked?" Ezekiel asked, recognizing the moral struggle in the sheriff's eyes. Morse was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon, as if seeking guidance from the vast desert landscape. "Started suspecting things weren't right about 2 years ago. Too many folks losing their property to foreclosure, too many convenient accidents that left widows and orphans at Webb's mercy. But suspecting and proving are different things, and Webb's been careful to keep his hands clean on paper." The sheriff's admission revealed the depth of institutional corruption that Ezekiel faced. Webb hadn't just targeted the Spanish treasure, he'd been systematically looting the entire community, using his position as banker to steal property from anyone too weak or isolated to resist effectively. But Morse's next revelation proved even more disturbing. "Your uncle came to see me 3 weeks before he died. Said he had evidence that Webb was forging documents, stealing from trust accounts, manipulating land sales. Jeremiah wanted to file formal charges, but he died before we could get the paperwork together." The implications were staggering. Uncle Jeremiah's death hadn't just been convenient for Webb's treasure hunting, it had been necessary to prevent exposure of the banker's broader criminal activities. And now Ezekiel found himself in the same dangerous position, possessing knowledge that could destroy Webb's carefully constructed empire of financial manipulation. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor who provided the final piece of the puzzle. Widow Hawthorne arrived at the ranch in obvious distress, carrying documents that revealed the personal cost of Webb's systematic corruption. "My husband didn't die of fever," she said, her voice shaking with suppressed emotion. "He died of poison something Webb put in his medicine when Tom started asking questions about irregularities in the bank's loan practices." Sarah's husband had been one of Masilla's few educated residents, a former schoolteacher who'd helped other settlers understand the legal documents they were signing. His questions about Webb's business practices had made him a threat that the banker had eliminated with the same cold calculation he'd used against Uncle Jeremiah. Tom kept records, Sarah continued, producing a leather portfolio filled with copies of documents that exposed Webb's crimes. Bank statements that don't match what folks were told they owed, property transfers that were never properly witnessed, loan agreements that were altered after signing. He was building a case against Webb when he died. The documents provided concrete evidence of systematic fraud that extended far beyond the Spanish treasure. Webb had been stealing from the entire community for years, using his position as banker to manipulate property ownership and drain wealth from anyone unable to defend themselves against sophisticated financial deception. But Sarah's most shocking revelation concerned Webb's knowledge of the Spanish treasure. Tom found correspondence between Webb and Spanish colonial historians back east. The banker's been researching territorial mining operations for over 5 years, following paper trails that led him to your uncle's property. This wasn't opportunistic crime, this was carefully planned theft based on historical research. The scope of Webb's scheme became clear as Sarah spread the documents across Ezekiel's table. The banker had identified the Spanish treasure years before Uncle Jeremiah's death, then systematically eliminated anyone who posed a threat to his plans for claiming it. Morrison and his criminal associates were just the violent enforcement arm of an operation that relied primarily on legal manipulation and institutional corruption. "We have to take this to the territorial governor," Sarah said. "Webb's corruption goes beyond what local law enforcement can handle." But Ezekiel understood that conventional legal channels offered little hope for justice. Webb's influence extended throughout the territorial government, and his carefully maintained reputation as a respectable businessman would protect him against accusations from people the authorities would dismiss as disgruntled debtors and grieving widows. "The governor's not going to move against Webb based on the word of folks like us," Ezekiel said. "We need something more direct, more immediate." As evening approached, Ezekiel realized that his situation had transformed completely. The enemy wasn't just Morrison's gang of violent criminals, it was an entire system of institutional corruption that had been bleeding the community dry while maintaining the facade of legitimate business practice. Webb had murdered at least 2 men, stolen from countless families, and corrupted the legal system that was supposed to protect innocent citizens from exactly this kind of predatory behavior. The Spanish treasure had become secondary to a larger fight for justice, not just for Uncle Jeremiah and Tom Hawthorne, but for every family that Webb had victimized over the years. And with Sarah's evidence providing the proof needed to expose the banker's crimes, Ezekiel finally had the tools necessary to fight back against corruption that had festered in darkness for too long. But Webb's next move would force the conflict into the open, where the banker's desperation might prove more dangerous than Morrison's threats of violence. The War Council convened at dawn in the sacred grove, where Chief Standing Bear's ancestors had once gathered to plan resistance against Spanish conquistadors. The parallel wasn't lost on any of the participants once again. Indigenous wisdom was being called upon to fight foreign invaders who sought to steal wealth from lands they had no right to claim. Ezekiel sat cross-legged on the hard ground, feeling every one of his 60 years in the ache of joints, unaccustomed to such positions. But the ceremony demanded respect for Apache traditions, and he understood that the alliance being forged here would determine whether justice prevailed or whether Webb's corruption continued to poison the community like a slow-acting toxin. Chief Standing Bear had brought 3 of his most trusted warriors, men whose faces bore the weathered dignity of those who'd spent decades protecting their people from threats both obvious and subtle. They listened with grave attention as Ezekiel explained the evidence Sarah had discovered, the scope of Webb's crimes, and the urgent need for action before the banker could destroy more lives. "Your uncle spoke of this evil," Standing Bear said, his voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom applied to modern problems. "He warned that men like Webb use papers and words as weapons more deadly than guns, stealing not just wealth, but the trust that holds communities together." The Apache had their own reasons for wanting Webb stopped. The bankers' land grabbing had gradually pushed legitimate settlers closer to Apache territory, creating tensions that benefited only those who profited from conflict. Webb's systematic theft had destabilized the entire region's economy, making peaceful coexistence more difficult and increasing the likelihood of violence that would harm both communities. "We offer more than protection for the sacred silver," Standing Bear continued. "We offer justice for crimes that territorial law has failed to address." The plan that emerged from their council session was both elegant and dangerous. Rather than relying on corrupted legal channels, they would force Webb into the open by threatening the one thing he valued more than the Spanish treasure, his carefully constructed reputation as a respectable businessman. Sarah's evidence would be distributed simultaneously to multiple targets: the territorial governor, the federal marshal in Santa Fe, and most importantly, the newspaper editors in both Albuquerque and El Paso, whose coverage would make Webb's crimes public knowledge throughout the Southwest. But the distribution had to be coordinated perfectly, preventing Webb from using his influence to suppress the revelations before they reached their intended audiences. Ezekiel's role in the plan required him to serve as bait, maintaining the pretense of ignorance about Webb's true identity while secretly preparing for the violent confrontation that would inevitably follow. The banker would be forced to act quickly once he realized that his crimes were about to be exposed, and his response would likely involve Morrison's gang in a desperate attempt to silence witnesses permanently. The Apache would provide tactical support, using their superior knowledge of desert terrain to monitor Webb's movements and intercept any attempts to flee the territory with stolen wealth. But the plan's success depended on timing that allowed no margin for error. A single mistake could result in Webb escaping justice while leaving his accusers vulnerable to retaliation. Sheriff Morse's position remained the most delicate aspect of their strategy. The lawman's integrity was unquestioned, but his oath of office required him to follow legal procedures that Webb had corrupted. Convincing Morse to act on evidence obtained outside official channels would require careful persuasion and irrefutable proof of the banker's crimes. "Clayton's a good man caught in a bad situation," Sarah explained as they finalized their plans. "He knows Webb is corrupt, but he needs legal justification to act. Give him that justification, and he'll do what's right, regardless of the personal cost." The afternoon was spent in careful preparation that felt remarkably similar to the pre-battle rituals Ezekiel remembered from his military service. Weapons were cleaned and loaded, supplies were gathered and distributed, and final messages were written in case the confrontation ended badly for those seeking justice. Chief Standing Bear presented Ezekiel with a ceremonial war lance, its wooden shaft decorated with eagle feathers and silver bands that caught the desert sunlight like captured starfire. The weapon was both practical tool and symbolic recognition. Ezekiel was being formally acknowledged as a warrior in the Apache tradition, someone willing to risk everything for principles that transcended personal interest. "Your uncle carried this lance when he helped us defend sacred places from men who would defile them for profit," Standing Bear explained. "Now it passes to you, along with the responsibility it represents." The weight of the lance in Ezekiel's hands felt heavier than its physical mass should have accounted for. He was holding generations of resistance against those who would exploit the weak, a tangible connection to men who'd chosen honor over safety and justice over personal comfort. That evening brought a visit from Sarah that carried implications extending far beyond their immediate crisis. She arrived at the ranch as the sun was setting, her face showing the strain of someone who'd spent days wrestling with life-changing decisions. "I've been thinking about what happens after we stop Webb," she said, settling beside Ezekiel on the porch where they could watch the last light fade from the western sky. "Assuming we survive this, assuming justice prevails, what then?" Her question touched on feelings that Ezekiel had been trying to ignore during the urgent business of planning their offensive against Webb's corruption. The shared danger had drawn them together in ways that peacetime friendship might never have achieved. and her presence had become the bright spot in days otherwise darkened by the weight of approaching violence. "Been thinking the same thing," he admitted. "Man my age doesn't get many chances to start over, to build something good with someone who understands what matters." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a messenger from town, one of the young men who worked in Sarah's store, bringing news that transformed their careful plans into urgent necessity. Webb had accelerated his timeline, apparently sensing that his enemies were closing in on evidence that could destroy him. "Banks closed early today," the messenger reported breathlessly. "Webb's been loading wagons all afternoon. Looks like he's preparing to leave town in a hurry. Morrison and his men are helping with the loading, and there's talk they're planning to head south toward the Mexican border." The implications were clear. Webb had decided to cut his losses and flee with whatever wealth he could carry, abandoning his elaborate schemes in favor of immediate escape. But his flight would also eliminate any chance of recovering the money he'd stolen from community members who could ill afford the losses. "How much time do we have?" Ezekiel asked, already calculating the logistics of intercepting Webb's escape route. "Wagons are loaded, but they're waiting for something," the messenger replied. "Maybe waiting for dark, maybe waiting for one more job before they run." Ezekiel realized what that final job would be. Webb couldn't leave witnesses who possessed evidence of his crimes. The banker would try to eliminate both Sarah and Ezekiel before fleeing, tying up loose ends that could otherwise lead to pursuit and eventual capture. The endgame was approaching faster than anyone had anticipated, but their preparations were as complete as time had allowed. The evidence was already in motion toward its intended targets. The Apache were positioned to cut off escape routes, and Sheriff Morse had been provided with enough proof of Webb's crimes to justify immediate action. All that remained was the confrontation itself, the final test of whether justice could prevail against corruption backed by violence and desperation. Ezekiel checked his weapons one final time, said a prayer for the souls of Uncle Jeremiah and Tom Hawthorne, and prepared to face the men who'd murdered his family and terrorized his community. The war lance stood propped against the cabin wall, its silver decorations catching the lamplight, like promises of dawn breaking over a landscape too long darkened by the shadows of evil men. The attack came with the first grey light of dawn, when the desert air held the chill that made men's breath visible and horses' hooves struck hard ground with sounds that carried for miles in the thin atmosphere. Morrison's gang approached Ezekiel's ranch with the practiced efficiency of men who'd conducted similar raids throughout their criminal careers, but they hadn't counted on facing an opponent who'd learned warfare under Andrew Jackson and formed alliances with the finest guerrilla fighters the continent had ever produced. Ezekiel had been awake for hours, positioned in the rocks above his cabin, where Uncle Jeremiah's worn Bible lay open beside Don Carlos's original mining pick, symbols of faith and perseverance that had sustained him through the long night of waiting. The Spanish tool felt solid in his weathered hands, its weight speaking of continuity between past and present guardians of the sacred silver that men had died to protect. Morrison led his 5 companions in a mounted charge, designed to overwhelm resistance through speed and superior firepower. But the ranch's terrain offered advantages that Ezekiel had spent weeks learning to exploit. Scattered boulders provided natural fortifications, while the slope of the land created channels that funneled attackers into predetermined killing zones where a single defender could hold off multiple enemies. The first shots came from Morrison's men as they closed to within rifle range, their bullets chipping stone and whining off into the desert morning like angry wasps. But Ezekiel had learned patience in warfare that younger men never mastered, waiting until his targets presented themselves clearly before responding with the deliberate accuracy that had made him valuable to Jackson's commanders. His first shot dropped Morrison's horse, sending the gang leader tumbling across hard ground, while his startled mount screamed and thrashed in the agony of a shattered foreleg. The second shot caught one of Morrison's companions in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle and reducing the attacking force by 2 men in the space of heartbeats. But the real surprise came from the flanks, where Apache warriors materialized from concealment with the silent efficiency of desert spirits given physical form. Chief Standing Bear's men had positioned themselves during the night, using terrain knowledge passed down through generations to create an ambush that turned Morrison's assault into a trap from which escape would prove nearly impossible. The Apache struck with traditional weapons that made no sound to warn their enemies, arrows that flew true to their marks, and war lances that found their targets with lethal precision. Two more of Morrison's men fell before they understood that they were facing not just one stubborn old rancher, but a coordinated defense that had been planned by masters of desert warfare. Morrison himself proved more dangerous than his hired guns, rolling clear of his dying horse and finding cover behind a fallen log from which he could direct what remained of his gang's attack. His revolver barked steadily as he tried to suppress Ezekiel's position while his surviving men attempted to reach better cover. "Should have taken the partnership offer, old man," Morrison shouted across the distance separating them. "Could have walked away rich instead of dying poor in this god-forsaken desert." Ezekiel's response came in the form of carefully aimed rifle fire that chewed splinters from Morrison's log shelter, forcing the gang leader to keep his head down, while Apache warriors closed the circle from multiple directions. The coordination between defenders had been practiced during their planning sessions, and it showed in the smooth efficiency with which they controlled the battlefield. The sound of approaching hoofbeats from the direction of town announced the arrival of Sheriff Morse with a hastily assembled posse of deputized townsmen. Sarah Hawthorne's evidence had provided the legal justification Morse needed to act, and the lawman had spent the night gathering volunteers who were ready to see justice done, regardless of the personal risks involved. Morrison's situation deteriorated rapidly as he found himself surrounded by superior numbers with no avenue of escape. His remaining men had taken casualties that left them more concerned with survival than completing their mission, and the gang's cohesion began to fracture under pressure they hadn't expected to face. "This is Sheriff Morse," the lawman called out from a position that blocked the only viable escape route. "You're surrounded and outgunned. Throw down your weapons and surrender peacefully." But Morrison had too much to lose to surrender easily. His crimes extended far beyond the current confrontation, and he understood that capture meant facing a hangman's noose for murders committed throughout his criminal career. Desperation made him more dangerous than rational self-interest would have allowed, driving him to fight when surrender offered the only realistic hope of survival. The standoff stretched through long minutes while both sides evaluated their options and prepared for the final phase of a confrontation that had been building for months. In the growing daylight, Ezekiel could see the strain on Morrison's face, the recognition that his carefully planned raid had become a disaster that would end his criminal career one way or another. The Spanish mining pick felt warm in Ezekiel's hands, as if the metal had absorbed heat from generations of men who'd used it to extract wealth from the sacred earth. Soon, very soon, the tool would serve its final purpose in the long story that connected Spanish conquistadors to Apache warriors to an aging Civil War veteran who'd learned that some treasures were worth more than silver. The final confrontation came not at the ranch, but at the Devil's Tooth Bluff itself, where Cornelius Webb had fled in desperation when he realized that his carefully constructed empire of corruption was collapsing around him. The banker had abandoned his loaded wagons and fled toward the Spanish mine, apparently believing that he could still claim the treasure that had motivated years of murder and theft. Ezekiel tracked him through terrain that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat, following boot prints in the red clay earth that spoke of a man running without regard for stealth or strategy. Webb's flight had the character of panic rather than planned retreat, and his destination suggested that greed had overcome whatever rational judgment he might once have possessed. The confrontation came at the sealed entrance to the deepest Spanish shaft, where Webb had been frantically trying to break through stone barriers that had protected the treasure for decades. His soft hands were bleeding from contact with rough rock, and his expensive clothes were torn by thorns and sharp stones that marked his desperate scramble through the desert. "It's over, Webb," Ezekiel called out, his rifle trained on the banker's heaving chest. "Your crimes are already public knowledge. Running won't change what you've done or bring back the men you murdered." Webb's response revealed how completely the pressure had shattered his facade of respectability. His face was streaked with dirt and sweat. His eyes held the wild gleam of a man who'd lost touch with reality, and his voice carried the high pitch of hysteria barely controlled. "You don't understand," Webb screamed, clawing at the sealed mine entrance like a man possessed. $12 million in silver, enough to buy anything, anyone. I can start over somewhere else, build a new life, make people forget what happened here." The banker's confession poured out in a torrent of self-justification and desperate rationalization. He admitted to poisoning Tom Hawthorne when the schoolteacher had grown suspicious of fraudulent bank documents. He confessed to arranging Uncle Jeremiah's accident when the old man had threatened to expose the systematic theft of community funds. And he revealed the scope of his partnership with Morrison, a relationship that had brought violent criminals into the territory for the sole purpose of claiming the Spanish treasure. But Webb's most shocking revelation concerned the extent of his historical research. The banker had spent years studying Spanish colonial mining operations, following paper trails through archives in Mexico City and Santa Fe that had led him to identify the Devil's Tooth site decades before Uncle Jeremiah's death. His murder of the old rancher hadn't been opportunistic crime, but the culmination of long-term planning designed to eliminate the only obstacle to claiming the treasure. "Your uncle was a fool," Webb ranted, his voice echoing off the stone walls of the bluff. "Sitting on a fortune and doing nothing with it. I offered to buy his worthless land for more than it was worth, tried to be fair, tried to give him a chance to profit from what he didn't even understand." Ezekiel's finger tightened on his rifle's trigger as rage threatened to overcome the discipline that military service had taught him. This soft, corrupt man had murdered Uncle Jeremiah for the crime of protecting something sacred, had stolen from families who trusted him with their life savings, had brought violence and death to a community that had welcomed him as a respectable businessman. But before Ezekiel could act on his anger, the sound of falling rock from above warned of immediate danger. Webb's frantic digging had destabilized the ancient Spanish construction, and the sealed mine entrance was beginning to collapse under the weight of centuries and the banker's desperate excavation. "Get away from there!" Ezekiel shouted, recognizing the signs of imminent cave, in from his experience with military engineering. "The whole entrance is coming down." Webb either didn't hear the warning or chose to ignore it, continuing his frantic assault on the stone barrier, even as rocks began falling around him. His obsession with the treasure had overcome whatever survival instincts he might have retained, driving him to risk death for the chance to claim wealth that had already cost too many lives. The cave-in came with a roar like thunder, tons of rock cascading down to seal the mine entrance forever, while Webb screamed in terror and pain. But even as the avalanche threatened to crush him, Ezekiel found himself moving without conscious thought, diving forward to drag the banker clear of the falling stones. They both tumbled to safety just as the final boulders crashed down, sealing the Spanish mine more completely than its original builders had ever intended. In the sudden silence that followed, Webb lay gasping in the red dust, while Ezekiel recovered from bruises that would remind him for weeks of his moment of instinctive mercy. From the debris at the cave-in site, a single object had been thrown clear by the rockfall, a gold medallion bearing the Spanish royal seal, the ultimate proof of the treasure's authenticity and value. The medallion caught the morning sunlight like a fragment of captured flame, beautiful and terrible in its significance. Webb reached for it with trembling fingers, but Ezekiel's boot came down gently but firmly on the banker's wrist. "That belongs to the community you stole from," he said quietly. "Time to start making amends for what you've taken." 6 months after the confrontation at Devil's Tooth Bluff, Masilla had transformed into a community that bore little resemblance to the struggling settlement where Ezekiel had once been mocked as a foolish old man clinging to worthless land. The main street bustled with activity that spoke of prosperity built on justice rather than exploitation, and the faces of townspeople carried the confidence that came from knowing their leaders could be trusted with their welfare. The Jeremiah Boone Memorial Fund had become the cornerstone of the community's renaissance, distributing recovered wealth in ways that honored Uncle Jeremiah's values, while addressing the practical needs of families who'd suffered under Webb's systematic theft. The fund operated under the guidance of a board that included Chief Standing Bear, Sheriff Morse, and Sarah Hawthorne, ensuring that decisions reflected both wisdom and compassion. Webb himself had been sentenced to 20 years of hard labor in the territorial prison, a fate that many considered too lenient for a man who'd murdered at least 2 innocent people. But his cooperation in recovering stolen funds and his detailed confession had helped the community rebuild what his crimes had destroyed. Morrison and his surviving gang members had received the hangman's justice that their violent crimes demanded, bringing closure to families throughout the territory who'd suffered from their predations. The Spanish silver remained safely sealed beneath tons of rock, protected by the cave-in that had ironically fulfilled the Apache prophecy about the treasure defending itself from those who would exploit it purely for profit. But the royal seal that had been thrown clear during the collapse had been authenticated by territorial historians, confirming the mine's estimated value and validating Uncle Jeremiah's decades of patient guardianship. Ezekiel stood on the porch of his rebuilt ranch house, watching the sunset paint the western sky in colors that had no names but spoke directly to the soul of anyone wise enough to appreciate their beauty. The house itself bore little resemblance to the ramshackle cabin where he'd discovered the Spanish documents. Sarah's influence had guided renovations that created comfort without sacrificing the practical simplicity that frontier life demanded. Their wedding had taken place 3 months earlier in a ceremony that blended Apache traditions with Christian customs, reflecting the cultural alliances that had made justice possible. Chief Standing Bear had officiated alongside the territorial minister, creating a service that honored both the sacred nature of marriage and the community bonds that held civilization together in harsh country. Sarah emerged from the house carrying 2 cups of coffee, her presence transforming the evening ritual from solitary contemplation into shared appreciation for blessings that neither of them had expected to receive at their stage of life. Her hair showed more gray than when they'd first met, but her eyes held the contentment of a woman who'd found love and purpose after years of loss and struggle. "Letter came from the territorial governor today," she said, settling beside Ezekiel on the bench they'd built together during the lazy afternoons of their courtship. "He's officially appointed you as regional supervisor for the Memorial Fund, with authority to investigate financial irregularities throughout the territory." The appointment represented recognition of Ezekiel's transformation from community outcast to respected leader, but it also carried responsibilities that would keep him busy for the remainder of his years. The territory was vast, and Webb's corruption hadn't been unique. Other communities harbored similar parasites who used respectability as camouflage for systematic theft. "Figure I'm getting too old for that kind of travel," Ezekiel said, though his tone suggested interest rather than reluctance. "Man my age ought to be thinking about settling down, enjoying what time he's got left." Sarah's laugh carried the warmth of a woman who'd learned to read her husband's true feelings beneath his carefully modest words. "Man your age just brought down the most corrupt banker in territorial history and survived a gun battle with professional killers. I don't think age has slowed you down as much as you pretend." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of visitors who'd become regular presences at the ranch. Apache families who came to trade, share news, and maintain the cultural bridges that had been built during their alliance against Webb's corruption. Chief Standing Bear's children had adopted Ezekiel as an honorary grandfather, teaching him their language while learning English phrases that would serve them well in the changing world. The evening's final visitor proved to be Sheriff Morse, who arrived with news that provided perfect closure to the long struggle for justice. The territorial court had officially recognized the Apache claim to the Devil's Tooth area as a sacred site, ensuring that the Spanish silver would remain undisturbed regardless of future political changes or economic pressures. "Seems fitting," Morse said, accepting coffee and settling into the comfortable rhythm of friends who'd shared danger and emerged stronger for the experience. "Your uncle always said some things were worth more than money, and I reckon protecting that mine proves his point better than any sermon ever could." As darkness settled across the desert and stars emerged in their ancient patterns, Ezekiel reflected on the journey that had brought him from despised inheritance to respected leadership. The Spanish treasure remained hidden, but its true value had been revealed through the community transformation it had made possible. Uncle Jeremiah's worn Bible sat open on the table beside them, its pressed flowers marking passages about faith rewarded and justice served. The Apache peace pipe rested nearby, its silver inlay catching starlight like promises kept to the living and the dead alike. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate with a voice that spoke of survival, adaptation, and the eternal persistence of life in places where only the strong and wise could flourish. Ezekiel smiled at the sound, understanding finally that he'd found his place in the vast scheme of things, not as the broken-down old soldier that Masilla had once mocked, but as a guardian of values that would outlast the silver that men killed to possess. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and the promise of rain, and Ezekiel Boone was content.